Hey, this is Mike Cazu, and you're listening to the Brute Strength Podcast. This week's guest is Daniel Schmachtenberger, co-founder and director of research and development at Neurohacker Collective, a company that specializes in developing things to improve cognitive function. Their only product out now is a nootropic called Qualia, which is basically to supercharge your brain. And so when I went into this conversation, I had intended to talk all about nootropics and ways to, what are some legal medicines that people can take to improve their brain function. But what we actually ended up talking about was, first off, what are basically the prerequisites for someone to be meeting before using these types of supplements. So we talked about adrenal fatigue and how to know if you're drinking too much caffeine. We talked about sleep, a little bit about nutrition, because the basic premise is that if you don't have some of these basic or all of these basics down pat, then it's like putting a turbocharger, and I'm using his wording here, a turbocharger in a car without an engine. So putting a turbocharger in a car without an engine means that the car will go nowhere. But if you have an engine without a turbocharger, then your car will still move. So we talked about the engine portion of the equation on this one, and then we're going to do a follow-up soon. Daniel is an incredibly intelligent guy, and I learned a ton from this one, and I know you will too. Enjoy the show. What's up, everyone? This is Mike Cazu. I'm here with Daniel Schmachtenberger, co-founder and director of R&D at Neurohacker Collective. Daniel, I know you're an incredibly busy guy. Thank you so much for making some time to do this with me, man. I'm very excited.
Happy to be here with you. This is fun.
Awesome. So before the show started, just now we were talking about my personal experience with caffeine and the fact that I've been taking way too much caffeine, and I got off completely for a couple weeks ago. And as we got into conversation about it, it sounds like I may need to take quite a bit more time off. And so I thought it might be an interesting place to start, because a lot of my listeners I know are caffeine addicts, right? There's even a company in the CrossFit space and weightlifting space called Caffeine in Kilos. And it's very, romanticized, and people just love their coffee. And so I think this would be a really useful conversation for us to kind of start out with, for people to know if they might need to do the same thing that I'm about to do. So what are the signs that someone is taking too much caffeine?
Mm-hmm. So step back a little bit and recognize that caffeine is a psychoactive chemical compound, right? We can say a psychoactive drug, and it's one of humanity's favorite ones, up there with alcohol and cannabis, etc., for a very long time, from tea and coffee and many sources. And I think it's a beautiful molecule and can actually have life extension and life enhancing properties used rightly. And like any tool, and especially the more powerful tool, can also have life damaging properties used improperly. And it's pretty easy to misuse caffeine. The easiest way to misuse caffeine is to use it to deal with tiredness from not resting enough. So if someone is not sleeping enough, or they're not sleeping well, and the way they notice that is that they're either tired in the morning when they wake up, say, to an alarm, they don't feel fully rested, or they get tired in the afternoon, their answer to it, rather than to rest, is to stimulate. That's how adrenal fatigue and burnout happens. And so, kind of paradoxically, caffeine is best used when people are already energized, and they are then using it for enhancement of metabolic activity in an already healthy system that can handle the stimulus, as opposed to in a under-rested, operating system that can't really handle the stimulus without damage. So that's the biggest thing. And there are so many people who use caffeine as as if it is a replacement for adequate or good sleep, or good rest in other ways. And that is a very fast way to make it very bad for you.
Right. So what you're kind of suggesting, it sounds like, is that one of the biggest benefits of caffeine is more to do with the metabolism rather than to do with boosting your energy and stimulating you in that sort of way. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, and even regarding the kind of stimulant properties, the central nervous system stimulant properties, the way it inhibits adenosine, the way that it has a dopaminergic effect, those still work much better on a well-rested system that can handle being stimulated without being damaged, right? Because if a system is getting tired, it means the body is endogenously down-regulating rather than up-regulating because it wants to be in a rest and repair place rather than in a fully on and utilized place. So when the body needs to be in a rest and repair place and we stimulate it to be in an on place, that is at the cost of the integrity of the system.
Gotcha.
So that's the first big thing with regard to caffeine is it's really critical that caffeine is not being used because it's needed. It's being used when it's not needed as an enhancement to the system.
Gotcha.
And that's not just caffeine. That's if someone's using nicotine, if they're using theobromine, if they're using any kind of stimulant, it's important to keep that in mind.
So before we go into how to identify if someone is taking too much of caffeine or any stimulant, why is it even important? Like, what are the dangers to someone's performance and even health?
Yeah, so many things. If you look at adenosine inhibition, so adenosine is a neurochemical that helps bring on the sleep impulse. And so caffeine inhibits that molecule. If you're trying to inhibit it when it's coming on strong because it needs to come on, then you'll end up getting imbalances in your adenosine cycle and in your circadian cycles, which will look like not getting as good a quality sleep and not getting as much repair during your sleep. It can then look like resistance to adenosine inhibition. And so you'll notice that by having less of an effect from coffee, where you can take coffee or any source of caffeine and still fall asleep afterwards. That means that your ability to inhibit the adenosine cycle is, it's been downregulated. And then specifically, adrenal fatigue and adrenal burnout happens largely when you continue to stress a system that has been stressed and now needs to repair before you give it adequate repair. And when you understand all of the roles that the adrenal glands have in converting neurologic impulse to endocrine impulse, it's involved in fat metabolism and muscle repair and lean body muscle mass. It's involved in everything from genetic transcription to the regulation of the rest of the endocrine system to immune function to bone density. And so overstimulating and overtaxing your adrenal system is definitely not something somebody wants to do.
Got it. So what are some signs? What are some other signs that people can look for? What are some tests they can give themselves?
Yeah, one of the common ones is that the stimulating effect that caffeine had early in someone's use, it doesn't have anymore. And that's the sign of desensitization, downregulation. Mm-hmm. So they used to drink 8 ounces of coffee and feel increased wakefulness. Now they have to drink more coffee to still notice a smaller effect. If you used to not be able to fall asleep on coffee and now you can fall asleep on it, if you need more than you used to need, if you are having a sense of needing it or needing it more times in the course of a day, later into the day, if you're noticing the effects less, these are all signs of desensitization, downregulation. So one of the key things with pretty much anything is, in terms of anything that we're taking in other than like water and air, is cycling. And so just like with workouts, you need to have cycles between stressing the muscles and then letting them rest and repair. And you want to kind of cycle between different workouts, because if you keep doing the same workout, you start to desensitize to that particular stimulus, and you will get less from it than if you cycle it to another way of stressing the muscle. And if you think of it from a evolutionary point of view in terms of chemistry coming into the body, pretty much other than water, there was no food source that was always available all year round. And so our body was consistently getting different kinds of chemical input and then regulating in a hunter-gatherer kind of environment. So rotating our foods and rotating our supplements and et cetera is valuable, and different ones need to rotate on different cycles. There are some things that downregulate quickly, like this isn't a supplement, but from a kind of neurohacking point of view, if someone does MDMA, they don't have to do that many times before their system will start to acclimate to it, downregulate, and then have pretty bad symptomology if they stop doing it. So someone really shouldn't do that more than, and it's going to depend on their individual physiology. Some people might be able to do it a couple times a month. Some people only once every several months. So the cycle there has to be relatively little on, lots of off. Whereas, say, someone is taking resistant starch as a prebiotic, they can take that most of the time, but pretty much anything should be cycled off now and again. Mm-hmm. With regard to caffeine, it's actually a molecule that people habituate to and then get a low level of addiction or dependence quite quickly, which is the signal of that is getting headaches when you come off of it. Mm-hmm. And so letting people stay in an on cycle longer so that they're not dealing with, say, headaches every week as they're cycling off, on the weekend. The general recommendation I give to most people is if they want to use caffeine regularly as opposed to just now and again, which I think is fine to do if you're sleeping enough and not overusing it, is give or take 1 week every quarter you come off of it. And the first couple days suck. You can take ibuprofen for headache if you need to. Sleeping those first few days extra is valuable because even if we're good about sleep, almost all of us end up accumulating little bits of sleep debt now and again. And sleep banking actually does work to some degree. So at least a week per quarter off. Now, if someone has not done that for a long time, so they've been on their caffeine source regularly for years, and especially if they have underslept in association with that, and especially if they have taken more than the caffeine than they should be to begin with, and they've kind of down-regulated their sensitivity, they might need to come off for much longer than a week before they get to re-regulate adequately and move back to healthy relationship to it. And depending upon someone's caffeine metabolism, which is, largely genetic, depending upon the health of their adrenal glands and their nervous system, that can be a pretty huge variance. But there are people who, when they cycle off of pretty intensive caffeine usage, are still dealing with side effects of coming off for 3 months.
Wow.
And for the time period that people are dealing with that, it's actually really important to not get back on caffeine because you really want your system to re-find its homeostasis, right? To find its homeodynamics. And there are things one can do to support themselves. They can try taking other kinds of stimulants as a way of stepping down, and then getting off those too. So butamine, which is a synthetic version of B1, which actually upregulates the sensitivity of the D1 and D2 dopamine receptors, which are partially affected and downregulated by the caffeine, can actually help someone come off of it faster and easier. And so butamine and tyrosine together often can be utilized for that. Adrenal support in general, B vitamins, adaptogenic herbs, and mostly, more than anything, is just a lot of sleep banking. Mm-hmm. So when people are coming off of having been on too much caffeine or any kind of stimulant for a long time, taking 3 or 4 days where they just sleep as much as they can, even if that's 12 or 16 hours a day, can make a tremendous difference to how quickly someone feels better, their cognitive function increases, their physiologic function increases.
Damn. Well, like I was telling you before, I only took 2 weeks off about a month ago. And as we were talking, it sounds like I've overused caffeine to a huge extent for a very long time. and I probably have to go back in and take some more time off. And I didn't get any headaches whatsoever, but one of the worst things for me was I was just incredibly irritable. Like the smallest things would agitate me or stress me out. I felt just this enormous amount of pressure when nothing had changed other than I stopped drinking coffee. It was a crazy feeling.
Right. Yeah, coming off of caffeine is, again, it's going to be much harder for some people based on genetics than others, much harder for some people based on how dependent they were on it, factoring all those things, how long they've been doing it, how much they were doing, adrenal exhaustion. But in the cases where someone's dependence on it is stronger, Caffeine Informer is a good website, and they give a good breakdown of caffeine in different products and science around caffeine, metabolism, etc. But if you read on there, even though they're a website that, you know, is supportive of people understanding caffeine and the positives of it well, when you read about the experiences of people who are going through withdrawals and come downs, many of them sound a lot like people coming off of stronger stimulants like meth, in terms of experiencing irritability, anxiety, and then worse, even depersonalization, derealization. So, and just to kind of step back from thinking about caffeine for a minute, like even meth is a cool molecule. It's one that, again, people regulate to so quickly, and it creates override and dependence in the dopaminergic system so quickly and has so many side effects. I just really don't recommend. But no, it was used so widely in the 50s, 60s before we recognized all the issues of it. And Adderall now is an amphetamine. It's just, the only difference between methamphetamine and Adderall is one methyl group. But like all of these things have the possibility of positive therapeutic application. Take exercise, right? People can exercise in ways where they exceed what their body should do and they injure themselves rather than benefiting themselves.
Right.
And so pretty much anything, even if it can be good for you or really is good for you in most applications, can also be used irresponsibly. And the more powerful something is, the more one has to be mindful, and the less one has been mindful, the higher the probability that there has been some irresponsible use.
Right. I love that perspective. I appreciate that. I'm gonna give it another shot. So I want to dive into neurohacking. The company you own is called Neurohacker Collective, and I think everyone out there has heard of the term neurohacking, but I think there are probably a lot of misunderstandings and myths surrounding the word. So first off, can you just describe briefly what neurohacking is?
So I'll describe the way that we think of it and kind of how we define it. So neurohacking for us is utilizing any kinds of tools, technologies, processes that have the ability to upregulate some aspect of brain or nervous system function or associated body function that then affects brain or nervous system function, largely for the purpose of being able to upregulate some aspect of cognitive or emotional function. We're specifically looking at the mind-brain interface mostly. Now, we could, of course, look at the brain just for its effect on the body, like increased coordination and, sensory systems, motor systems, and that's also kind of in the periphery of it. We're largely looking at how do we support the body to affect the mind and emotions. Also, what can we do with mind and emotions to affect the body and brain? And how do we kind of hack the mind-brain interface for both better subjective experience and increased capacities? And how do we do it in ways that are not just upregulating to some capacity in the moment, but with side effects and downregulation of something meaningful long-term? But how do we do it in a way that is sustainable, regenerative, and where we're actually more focused on upregulating regulatory capacity itself rather than just upregulating some particular kind of stimulus in a way that might override the integrity of the system?
What do you mean? Can you explain that last bit a little bit further?
Sure. So let's say we're going to talk about stimulants again. Stimulants are tools of neurohacking, but most of them don't fit into what we would consider good neurohacking tools. So let's say we take Adderall. There are, outside of its medical application, there are many people who take Adderall or other kinds of smart drug stimulants to be able to launch their tech startup, to get through their taxes, to do their midterms or finals, whatever it is, because they're having a hard time focusing adequately, and this is helping them. So Adderall is primarily working on your dopamine system. It's a presynaptic dopamine agonist, so it's making your neurons produce more dopamine. And dopamine is involved in the ability to focus and drive, right? So if you're trying to do something that is kind of easy to procrastinate and get distracted from, increased focus and drive are pretty great. Now, how does the body naturally produce and regulate dopamine, right? If we think of what we'd call the endogenous dopamine regulatory system or the internal dopamine regulatory system, there's a whole lot of things that happen, right? You eat protein that contains phenylalanine. The protein has to get digested, get absorbed through the gut. The phenylalanine converts to tyrosine, converts to an acetyltyrosine, converts to L-DOPA, converts to dopamine, goes across a synapse, passes a bunch of enzymes that are trying to break it down, MAOB, COMT, etc., gets received into some postsynaptic neurons. There's a bunch of things that happen to have a regulated dopamine process. And we don't want kind of peak dopamine all the time, right? If you are wanting to have kind of intense focus, concentration, recognize patterns, the body will naturally upregulate dopamine for that purpose. If you're wanting to relax and meditate, calm down, make love, participate in some art, you might want dopamine to drop a lot. You might want serotonin to come up, right? So your body is naturally regulating all of these chemicals in relationship to what's actually adaptive to the environment and what's going on. Now, so that regulatory cycle has the ability to pay attention to what's needed and then up or down regulate levels of anything and anything in relationship with everything else that's going on. Now, if I just give someone a presynaptic dopamine agonist, if I give someone something that just basically is going to kind of elevate their dopamine and fix it, then a few things happen. One, they're no longer as adaptive to their environment because their dopamine is not being internally regulated. It's being externally regulated, which is why a lot of people on any kind of psychiatric med, one of the things that even if it stabilizes them that they describe is oftentimes feeling more numb because now their neurochemistry and thus their emotional state is more fixed and independent of what's happening, so they don't feel their own ability to kind of respond to and react to and feel what's happening, right? That's not desirable. One of the other things that's happening, if we kind of just fix the dopamine, is the dopamine is elevated irrespective of all the things that it should exist in specific ratios and dynamic equilibrium with. So the relationship of dopamine to then the other catecholamines, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and its relationship then on the other side, the neuroinhibitory side to serotonin. We did mess with all those intentionally. So now we start getting kind of weird imbalances in neurochemistry. And then because we're just elevating that in-chain molecule and being able to keep it elevated, the body's own ability to produce dopamine without it can start to drop, which is what creates dependence, what we call addiction. And the body's ability to, the way it's processing dopamine changes. So if dopamine starts being very high ongoingly, without the body having produced it in the synapse, then the body might start down-regulating the dopamine receptor sensitivity because there's too much coming through. And then if you get off of the Adderall or meth or whatever it is, now the natural amount of dopamine you produce is less than it was before, and your receptors are even less sensitive to dopamine because there was these higher amount. Now you're experiencing this pretty terrible withdrawal and crash. And so rather than just give someone a state, we want to support their own brain, body, mind capacity to produce the states that are relevant in response to the environment in real time. So that's what we mean by upregulating the regulatory capacity of the system rather than overriding the regulatory capacity to just fix a specific state.
So something like Adderall, Yes, let's just take Adderall. So something like Adderall will go in and produce a ton of basically fill the brain with dopamine, release all of it at once, and then leave it in worse shape than it was in the first place. And what you're kind of suggesting, or what you guys are working on, is things that can leave the brain in better shape than when you found it.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about, I know your audience is very connected to the CrossFit world, and if you think about the philosophy of the CrossFit world in the sense of general preparedness and general capability for lots of different kinds of activity, the whole goal is increasing the adaptiveness of the being physically, right? That it is not someone that can just lift a lot of weight but can barely move, or someone that could run fast but couldn't handle weight when it can come, or it's the sense of kind of how do we make the being actually more responsive, more adaptive, increase the responsive capacity. And so there's ways of both stressing the system and then allowing it to repair, and then stressing it in different ways. And so similarly with our own internal physiology, with our immune system, we want an immune system that can respond better to different kinds of pathogens faster. We want a repair system that can repair different kinds of injury faster, right? We want a neurochemical system that when we want to focus can go into intense focus, but when we need to be able to move our focus between a lot of things, task switching, we can move it between a lot of things without feeling stressed or irritated by something moving our attention. So how do we increase our overall adaptiveness as a being? Now, of course, neurohacking doesn't imply that. A lot of, like, just if you're doing anything that is changing the way the nervous system operates for some intentional purpose, that's a broad definition of neurohacking. I'm just taking the next step to say the kind of neurohacking we actually value and respect is the kind that, while it is enhancing some instantaneous capacity, it is also enhancing long-term capacity, or at minimum not damaging it.
Love it. I've got a two-part question for you next. So first off, before we get deeper into optimizing brain function, what are some of the prerequisites that people should be doing consistently before considering some of these neurohacking supplementation, these ways of supplementing? And if they are not meeting those prerequisites, are things like nootropics, neurohacking supplementation, are they even beneficial?
Mm-hmm.
And so with those prerequisites, I'm talking nutrition and lifestyle mainly.
Sure. It's a nuanced question, so I'm going to answer it a couple ways. The first part is, I would say, to the degree that someone can have the foundational aspects of lifestyle be what they focus on first, and then any kind of enhancement be what they build on top of that foundation, that's a good rule of thumb. And so if someone, for instance, isn't sleeping well, either they aren't dropping into deep delta sleep, or they aren't getting enough sleep, then say the person starts taking immune supportive herbs. Well, most of the immune repair only happens at night when you're sleeping and during delta sleep. If you're not getting enough delta sleep, those herbs are just not going to do that much. If you're taking things that are going to support tissue synthesis, most of the tissue repair happens during delta sleep. If you're taking nootropics that are going to support things like memory consolidation happens during delta sleep, and some aspects happen during theta sleep. And so you're going to get a kind of tiny fraction of anything that you're taking that's going to help your regenerative capacity if you're not doing the foundational thing that is where regeneration occurs. We can also look at diet and say, all right, say I'm going to take some supplements, and even if I take a handful of pills a day, I'm still talking about a relatively tiny amount of grams in comparison to the total amount of food I eat per day. And all of that food is chemistry that is not just macros that are going to be affecting my body fat and muscle composition, but they are all of the micros that are affecting what my brain is made out of, what my hormones are made out of, what all my tissues are made out of, and cells. And so all of that food is either medicine or toxicity or somewhere on that spectrum. And so if somebody is taking in food that is not providing adequate nutrition, and especially if it's providing toxicity, and then they're going to try and just override that by taking supplements, it's kind of like taking caffeine instead of sleeping, right? Mm-hmm. It's just, so the reason that the word supplement is used is it means in addition to, right? So if you think about, maybe, I think most people on your podcast will probably be familiar with this. If you think about the way that like a turbocharger or a supercharger added to an engine moves more oxygen through the engine so you can get more combustion, a turbocharger without an engine doesn't do anything at all.
Great analogy.
An engine without a turbocharger still does a lot. Mm-hmm. And so if you think of the engine as lifestyle, and you think about all the kind of hacking as like adding a badass turbocharger, there's no question it can make you go a lot faster, but it has to be on top of foundation. Otherwise, it just doesn't work that well. So now that's the main thing I would say. And so the foundations, everybody knows what the foundations are. Nobody likes to hear about them because they're hard and we don't really like doing them and we want like new shit. But I'm going to put to the foundation: sleep, exercise, movement, food, diet, nutrition, stress management reduction, and those kinds of categories. We can get into more things that you could fit in there, but let's just call those kind of the primary foundational categories. I'm going to put sleep in its own category and say that if someone is having even the tiniest bit of sleep deficit, it has a degree of negative effect on their whole system that a little bit of poor nutrition or a little bit of inadequacy in exercise just doesn't have.
Got it. Interesting.
And so we know that exercise affects the genetic transcription pattern of thousands of genes. That's a huge fucking deal. It's like our genome doesn't really matter that much. Genetic transcription matters because if you have a gene that's just kind of sitting there quiet, even if it does code for elevated homocysteine or whatever, it doesn't matter, right? It only matters if it's actually coding and those proteins are being built. So you can change what is actually expressing genetically from lifestyle factors. And so exercise, profoundly, if you're looking at being able to affect thousands of genes, that's a huge deal. It's affecting, exercise can upregulate BDNF, which is a brain-derived neurotrophic factor, upregulates the production of new neurons in your brain, which prevents neurodegenerative disease, repairs nerve damage, increases cognitive and emotional capacity. I mean, like if you've made a list of all things exercise can do, and its effects on decreasing depression and decreasing likelihood for every kind of major chronic illness, it's hard to imagine that anything could be more powerful than that. And the same with diet. When you think about all the negative effects of excessive sugar, of so many kinds of processed foods, of toxins that can be in foods, of inflammatory foods, and the positive effects of having your micronutrients be adequate minerals, vitamins, etc. There's nothing like, all of these categories are foundational. If you get really great sleep but eat shitty, you'll have problems. If you get really great exercise and eat shitty, you'll have problems. Like none of them replace the other ones, but you will get more profound problems faster from sleep issues than any of the other ones. So I really do think, and it's such an easy one. It's such an easy one to cut because it's just boring and life is interesting and there's a lot of shit we want to do. And it's so easy to have this, like, I'll sleep when I'm dead thought, give me more caffeine. Like, I want to do stuff. Mm-hmm. One of the things that is fascinating to me is in the sleep deprivation studies, as someone is moving into deeper degrees of sleep deprivation in time. So one thing that's very interesting, say someone naturally wakes after 8 hours sleep. And so instead they set their alarm and they were going to get to bed on time, but they like checked one last email or did one thing. So they just got 7.5 hours sleep. That still seems like a lot. A lot of people only get 6, 7.5. I'm pretty good, but it's actually a half hour of sleep debt. If you add that up times a lot of nights, right? It doesn't take very long for it to be missing a whole night of sleep. And you think about how someone feels in that case, and then missing weeks of sleep, right? As it goes on over time, that really happens. And so we'll notice that some of the symptoms are things like verbal fluency and word recall. If you're looking for a word or you're looking for a name and it's kind of on the tip of your tongue, but it takes a minute to find it, that's a pretty classic sign of sleep debt. And that shouldn't be. That's not just like aging or being human or not having a high IQ. That's actually a sign that your brain is not functioning that well. And it can be from different reasons, but it's most commonly a sleep debt. If you just completely fucking forgot where you parked or where you put your keys or your phone or what you were doing last or something like that, so your short-term memory has that level of capacity for impairment, that's not normal. That's actually a sign of dysfunction. And the most common reason for it is sleep. Now, it can be for other reasons. It can be nutrition deficiency. It can be stress overload. It can be exposure to toxins, neurotoxins, mold, etc. But sleep's the most common one, and sleep helps with all those other things. So one of the interesting things, though, is that as someone is moving into sleep debt, at first they notice it and they go, oh, I'm a little bit tired, if they had been sleeping well. And then they're like, oh, I'm getting more tired. But as someone gets deeper into sleep debt, they stop recognizing that they're getting deeper into sleep debt. And so there is actually a mismatch between someone's own self-assessment of how much sleep debt is there and how much sleep debt's actually there. It's very much like drunk people who can't recognize how drunk they are because their brain is misassessing it. The tired brain is misassessing this also from just an evolutionary adaptation, right? Like think about mothers who have an infant baby. They're just not going to get enough sleep for a while, right? Unless they just have one of those magical babies that sleeps all night long and they have a husband that does a lot and maybe a nanny in a community, they're going to go through a period of sleep debt. And so to be aware of how much they were in sleep debt would just suck. So they just kind of there's this evolutionary adaptation to be less aware of it. But the problem, of course, is that we can then exploit that lack of awareness to keep going. And so most people will have a situation where they're like, say, only operating at 70% of capacity, but they think they're operating at 90% of capacity. And that misassessment is actually the cause of a lot of problems. So when you were asking about foundations, I really do put sleep in its own category. And then next, I'm going to put nutrition and what people are taking in their mouth. I'm going to put movement. Exercise will be a subset of that. And I'll put the relationship to stress, which is going to have to do with the relationships in their life, the nature of their work, the way they create meaning, how they've processed old trauma, whether they give themselves time to meditate, journal, etc., do things to process it. Now, then we can put other categories like someone's home environment. That's kind of a big deal. If they live in a house that, say, has mold in it, or they live in an environment that's actually dangerous, so they're stressed out all the time or dealing with physical stressors, or they're around people who are either particularly negative or have lifestyle habits that influence them in the wrong direction. So environment, people and physical environment can really kind of be argued as another foundational category.
Tell you what, let's stop it right there. I want to pull on a couple of those categories, and
Yes.
and I'm realizing that we could have a 4-hour conversation and not get through everything I wanted to get through. So I'm just gonna go down a couple of these different avenues. First off, that misassessment is absolutely fascinating, because one of the things I was going to bring up is that so many people, they think they're operating at 100%. And when you suggest a couple things, whether it be, nutrition or sleep advice, they don't really see the point because they feel like they are operating at 100%. I'm curious, are there any like kind of biggest bang for your buck type interventions or changes that you think most or all people should make? All is obviously not going to work, but most people are deficient in and need to change in their diet.
In their diet, yeah.
Yes.
this is a lot of things, and there are some things that are true across the board, and then there's a lot of things that are going to be different for different goals and different physiologies. You had asked me previously a question about a diet that focuses mostly only on macros and being flexible with it. Mm-hmm. If someone is focused on their physique, and so they want to make sure that they are, burning more calories than they are consuming in a day, or consuming just enough that they're big growing muscle. And so they're really kind of macro focused, and being more flexible with which foods they can get their macros from, so they can actually sustain that for a while. Mm-hmm. We totally get why that diet evolved, and it is grossly underaware of lots of things that are relevant other than just like short-term physique and flexibility of how one does that, right?
Right. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you might mean is like most people that follow that kind of diet are uninformed on the importance of micronutrients.
So a few things. Micronutrients is going to be the first thing about that diet that is off. There's several other things.
Well, couldn't you potentially follow that kind of diet, but also keep in mind all of your micronutrients?
Kind of.
Okay. Keep going.
So macros are, where you get calories from, right? Protein, fat, mm-hmm. carbs. And this isn't the normal definition, but someone can also kind of think of water and fiber as macros. They're not caloric sources, but they're things that you need a lot of each day, right? But then your micronutrients are your vitamins, fat-soluble, water-soluble vitamins, your minerals, your macro minerals and your trace minerals, and then all the phytochemicals and polyphenols and enzymes and et cetera that come from a natural diet and a wide variety of natural foods. You could say, well, can't I just take a multivitamin, multimineral, and not kind of worry about that? I would say that's better than not doing it, and a far way from actually having a evolutionarily relevant diet, mm-hmm. because the form of nutrients from natural sources, let's just say from a plant source, it could be plant or animal source, you'll have a plant that has a mineral that is bound in multiple different forms. So, you're not just going to be dealing with, say, celery. You'll have sodium as a little bit of sodium chloride and sodium bicarb and sodium biphosphate and, many different forms. You take a magnesium supplement and maybe it's magnesium citrate. The body has, give or take, 13 different forms of magnesium that we know of that it utilizes very differently in different kinds of tissues. So magnesium for brain health versus magnesium for its kind of electrolyte properties, or in muscles or heart or adrenals, different forms. Natural foods do a better job of giving you a wider variety of those things. Also, oftentimes with cofactors, some of which won't be in the multi, some of which we don't even understand that well, that will affect absorption. And then things that we don't even usually think of as micros, like all of the antioxidants and all the polyphenols, all of the plant-based enzymes, etc. So those matter a lot. And what we know about life extension right now, kind of the best thing we still know about life extension, we know, quite a few things, is caloric restriction is meaningful for life extension in all mammals, mm-hmm. including humans. And when we look at the people from blue zones who live the oldest, the areas where you have the most people that live over 100, their diets can be a little bit different, but one of the commonalities is that they are in general taking in less calories than we are. They're in slight caloric deficit, but they're taking their calories from micronutrient-rich sources. So their diet is lower in macronutrients, higher in micronutrients, which means they, are in caloric restriction without being in nutrient restriction.
Interesting. Got it.
Which is the exact opposite of empty carbs, mm-hmm. right? So this is why getting food from organic, biodynamic, local, seasonal, rotating, whole food, etc. sources actually makes a big difference is all of those other compounds. Now that's one thing, right? Is that actually getting the good things from food, other than macros, is really important. One on the other side, not getting bad things from food is also really important. And not getting bad things from food means inflammatory compounds. So and this is going to be a little bit the same for everyone and a little bit different. Most people will have inflammatory reactions or have a probability of having inflammatory reactions from a lot of common things. So pasteurized dairy, hybridized grains, excessive sugar, etc. Those are all going to be probably inflammatory for most people.
And you're not just talking about inflammation in the joint. You're talking about internal inflammation throughout, like systemic throughout the body, right?
Yeah, starting in the gut and then having systemic effects that originate in the gut.
And is there anything, any kind of identifying markers that people can look for?
Sure.
Yeah. Rather than just going to a lab?
I thought you were asking lab markers.
That's okay too.
Yeah.
But yeah, the easiest first.
So again, this is tricky because there are a lot of different inflammatory markers and different ones show up first for different people. So the inflammatory markers that a normal non-functional medicine doc will most commonly run is they'll run CRP and sed rate, and maybe homocysteine. And those are primarily kind of cardiac inflammatory markers that are predispositions for heart disease. There are plenty of people that actually have full-blown inflammatory diseases where none of those are elevated. We might see calprotectin elevated, showing inflammation in the bowels, and we can have kind of inflammatory bowel disease without any of the heart inflammatory markers. We can see specific cytokines that are elevated that are going to lead to autoimmune diseases like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis or fibromyalgia or PMR. And then there are people who have like elevated histamine, maybe just genetically, that leads to inflammation. You'd have to kind of specifically look at that, including neuroinflammation, or who have lectin sensitivity, which you can see through different markers like adenopectin, which lead to sensitivity to lectin-rich foods. So one thing I would say here is for people who are interested in optimizing health, going to work with a good functional medicine doctor who can kind of take in their symptoms, take in their goals, and then prioritize labs with them and create customized protocols is highly recommended. Think about this. Think about all the times that you heard about someone who got some intense headache, went to the doctor, had a brain scan, found out they had a pretty serious brain tumor, and they got diagnosed with a few months left to live. But they were completely asymptomatic, and that brain tumor was growing for years. Similarly, and whether it's a brain tumor or a tumor anywhere else, the absence of symptom does not mean the absence of pathogenesis, right? You can have the development of pathology asymptomatically for a long time. And when we're looking at autoimmune disease, when someone starts having enough joint pain that they actually go check it out and they get diagnosed with rheumatism, it's not uncommon to see autoimmune antibodies or inflammatory cytokines years and sometimes even decades before someone would have got that diagnosis from symptomology. Why that's a big deal from a preventive medicine point of view is if you see the early signs of it and the person doesn't have the symptoms, it can very easily mean they never have to get them. Because you can stop and you can prevent progress of the disease and usually even reverse it if you know what you're doing when you get those markers. So, if someone is in symptomology, then obviously go tend to it. But if someone is really interested in you're trying to optimize your fitness and your energy levels and your health right now, but you want to keep optimizing those rather than have them, degrade relatively rapidly in age, then having a sense of what's really going on in your body and being able to address things ahead of time and have a personalized approach based on what's actually going on for you is a good idea.
And is just any functional med doctor acceptable, or are there certifications and identifying marks for those doctors that you would recommend people seek out?
Tricky. One of the things that is on our goal list for our company is actually being able to make a directory of functional doctors and other kinds of therapists that can recommend people in whatever city someone's in based on what kinds of trainings they've done and reviews, etc. There's certainly some things you can look for. So functional medicine is a specific branded thing. The Institute of Functional Medicine is it has very good trainings. It's some of the better trainings that are kind of standardized right now. You can also look at just people who call themselves naturopathic doctors and integrative doctors, and just kind of see if what they are doing is relevant to what your interests are. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if you have some GI issues, having a integrative or functional doctor who has some GI specialty, or if you're trying to build a lot of muscle, have one that is good at hormone optimization, right? You want to look at whatever your goals are, someone who has some specialization and experience with those topics. And then right now, the best you can probably do is check out reviews and then go meet them and see if you resonate.
Done. So originally I wanted to really dive into nootropics and different neurohacking techniques, as well as longevity. But for most of this conversation, it's been kind of like, what are the precursors people need to have down before they consider that type of thing, which I think is a great starting place. So before we wrap up, I know people are going to have a ton of questions about the nutrition piece. What are 1, 2, or 3 resources that you would recommend people go to that are, widely varied and also digestible for lay people in terms of micronutrients and that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. I think nutrition is actually one of the trickiest topics. There is so much vested interest in people who have kind of authored books and just hold to a particular ideology of the kind of food people want to eat, of the associated morality and ethics and lifestyle and culture elements, that there are very few topics that are less coherent across the whole field than this one. Mm-hmm. Medicine does not, like within the field of integrative medicine, there's not as much intense difference as there is in foundational nutrition. Similarly, there's not that much difference in thoughts on sleep. A classic example is people who are in the more raw food and more vegan and more kind of calorie restriction direction, and then people who are in the more ketogenic diet, primal diet, paleo direction. They both reference a lot of well-done science.
Right.
And there are really good scientists and doctors on both sides of that, and they both look at blue zone studies, but in very different ways. Some of it's because it's going to be different for different people's genetics, for different people's physiology, how they approach it, etc. So I would say there are general rules of thumb. To say one should eat closer to the living ecosystem is a generally good rule of thumb, meaning the more processed and packaged, hybridized, sprayed, etc. something is, the worse it is in general. It's not an absolute truth, but it's a general truth. And the closer to things that have been what our bodies evolved to eat over very long periods of time, and particularly also with less pesticides and herbicides and things that are designed to kill life on them. And the more they come from healthy soils rather than pretty demineralized soils, and the fresher they are versus they've been out of the ground for a pretty long time. These are all, and to the degree it's meats, then grass-fed, free-range, etc. That's kind of important across the board, whether you're eating meats or not, or these ones or not, or nightshades or not. Like, kind of dial that in second. Dial in this general approach to things that would have been part of a living ecosystem first. And I would say then the next good rule of thumb is paying attention to how you feel as pretty closely as you eat different things. So pay attention right after a meal. Do you have a sense of over fullness in your belly, like you're having a hard time digesting it? Do you have GI symptoms afterwards? Do you get tired after eating it? Do you get hungry again right away? Do you have energy for a while? Do you sleep well afterwards? The more you can do kind of a really attentive, quantified self-assessment, just even spend a few weeks and journal what you're eating and then journal how you're feeling in association and dial it in. The combination of the general rule of thumb of eating evolutionarily relevant foods and paying attention to which ones feel good for you, that would be foundational. Then study specific diets on top of that, and then do actual functional medicine where you look at your nutrient levels and your food allergies, et cetera, on top of that. In terms of resources to go study more, the reason why I was hesitant to say the resources is they mostly all fall into camps that are very different than other camps, so have good things to say. So I think Dave Asprey's new book, Headstrong, is one of the best introductions to health for people who have not got into it yet that I'm aware of. I think it is people take different through lines of how they write a book like that, whether it's understanding healthy fats or whether it's understanding caloric restriction. The through line he took was cellular health, mitochondrial energy, and brain health. That's a great through line. And so then he looked at diet and exercise and sleep and toxicity and hacking techniques in light of that. I think a lot of what he has in the book is really foundationally great. It's not going to be appropriate for everyone. People will want to modify, but I think it's a great starting place. In terms of other people that have a similar-ish dietary philosophy, a lot of what Dr. Mercola writes on diet is kind of similar and, again, clinically well backed up. If you go speak to a normal cardiologist, they're still looking at Pritikin's work on extremely low-fat diets, having lower heart disease, living longer, and more Mediterranean diet. I think that is largely just older research, but not irrelevant. And I have seen people do bulletproof diet, ketogenic diet a little bit wrongly and have their lipid profile get super whacked. And so there is some need for nuance. And I actually think a lot of the raw food vegan communities has good things to say on diet. Even if you decide not to be vegan, you decide to eat some other, animal products with it. A lot of the insights on soil conditions and micronutrients in plants and therapeutic use of herbs and whatever there is great. So those are a few.
That's excellent. I appreciate that. So it sounds like there is no perfect diet, like one size fits all, which is kind of that's the case in just about everything in life, right?
There are rules of thumb. There are generalized principles, and then there's a lot of room for adaptation. And like what someone should eat if they are training heavily versus not, and training for powerlifting versus ultra marathons, and based on their genetics and age and what kind of medical conditions they have, that's all going to just be so different.
Right.
One thing I will also say is the idea that someone should not do kind of more advanced neurohacking, biohacking things if they don't have the foundations down. This is not totally correct. I wanted to take that perspective first because I wanted to emphasize foundations. But say we look at either use of nootropics or use of EEG neurofeedback or different kinds of sleep tech. Sometimes even if someone's foundations are screwed, they're screwed enough that the person's behavioral chemistry is out of whack enough that they just can't fix it. They can't actually get themselves to eat better, exercise well, sleep well regularly enough. And sometimes those interventions actually help the person enough that not only do they get the benefit of that intervention, but it helps them get the foundations down better.
To change their behavior, right?
Absolutely. So like one of the things that, we have found with, with Qualia and with Nootropics, is if people are having issues with sleep, if they're underslept or if they have kind of overused stimulants, they might need to fix that first. But otherwise, if say their diet is poor or their exercise is poor, it's been very common that people will start. Not all nootropics will be the same. Qualia specifically has a lot that balances the dopamine opioid axis, so it's actually helping work on the chemistry systems of motivation and behavior themselves. We've had a lot of people who just couldn't get themselves to be regular with exercise and diet. They got on that and then they actually were. So the general rule of thumb is someone does want to be focused on foundations, but if they're having a really hard time focusing with foundations, finding tools that can not support them to keep not doing foundations and think that they can just augment it, but things that can actually help them with the behavioral dynamics of doing the foundational work, that can be super useful.
That's a great perspective. I love that. Even if it is a placebo that gets them to change the behavior, then the important part is that they are changing their behavior, which oftentimes is the most important piece. So the fact that what you guys do is so holistic and has such long-term effects is just that much better. I love it.
Yeah, and sometimes therapy actually the right kinds of therapy can really help someone change patterns underneath their behavior. And like neurofeedback can help neuroregulatory patterns that can make a huge difference to just someone's state of health and well-being overall, stress processing, but also then how people react to stress and go into addictive patterns. So we can say both sides. We can say get foundations first and then do advanced techniques. We can also say if the advanced techniques can help you be able to do a better job with foundations that you've had as New Year's goals every year and not actually been able to stabilize, don't keep trying and failing at the same thing. See if additional tools can support you.
Right. I love that. So look, I am really dying to continue this conversation. We've opened so many doors, but we're going to have to save some of it for the next time. What do you have? What do you want to leave these listeners with, or do you have an ask of them?
Well, I enjoyed the time with you, and I'm looking forward to the next time. And if this was interesting and people have questions on other topics, my ask would be that they just tell you what they're interested in that we talk about next time. And other than that, my ask would be that they take more responsibility for their own health and well-being and life than they did previously. And that means study more so they can actually understand how to support themselves, because that will put them not just in the best position for their own health, but also in the best position to help other people and be an asset in the world.
That's phenomenal. Well, I'm definitely inspired. I'm going to make a few behavioral changes and then do some more self-experimentation with Qualia myself. And then once that is taking place, then we'll follow up again.
Sounds good.
Conversation. Thank you so much, Daniel. This has been phenomenal, man.
Likewise. Appreciate it.
All right, brother. Bye. Hey guys, I'm going to invite any of you that are interested to call into a voicemail that I have set up and leave some questions. So then I'm going to play back your question on the podcast, and I'm either going to answer the question myself or I'm going to get one of my guests to help me answer those questions. If you're interested, the number is 801-449-0503. That's 801-449-0503.